everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our JavaScript for the Claris FileMaker platform training. It's kind of a mouthful. Day 2 is awesome. Day 1 is in the can. We are working to get it edited up and recorded and posted for you. So as a reminder, one, we're recording all these sessions. There's about a day or 2-day delay in the recordings coming up online because we go through and clean them up. Any unsavoriness that happens, any nastiness, ugliness gets cut out. What is going on? People did have some questions. So week 1 and 2, we're doing the beginning, the basics of understanding JavaScript interaction with the FileMaker platform. In week 3, which is our paid content, is going to be a private invite. It's at a different time slot. It's about 2 hours earlier than our live stream. So we'll still have live streams in week 3. They'll be on some other topic, but the JavaScript for FileMaker with Leland will be a little bit earlier. That is available to the people who write a check and pay for that training. $299 gets you into that event. And that's mainly to offset Leland's hard work of creating this training and creating this content for us. And so I encourage you, if you want to support, you want to see more of this kind of training, definitely purchase that. If you buy the training, you can come to the live event. You'll get a Zoom invite. You're also going to get the recordings after the fact. So if you miss this, so say that you see the recordings available in the future, you can always buy them at a later date if you want, right? They'll be available for a period of time. So I want to welcome all of you to that. Now, questions about the Zoom. People said, hey, can I ask questions during the live training on week 3? Absolutely. You can type your questions. Depending upon the number of people in the training, we may or may not turn on the microphones for you. Maybe you don't want to have your microphone on. That's fine. We don't have to know who you are. And so we have to kind of be careful with the microphone action because we've had people decide to clean the toilet with a live microphone. And so we're working in FileMaker and you hear toilet action. So while that's entertaining, it's not excessively professional, right? So we try to limit that. But if we have a small group, we can make sure that you ask the questions via voice chat within the Zoom platform. So the week 3 paid training builds upon weeks 1 and 2. The goal of that is to build an executable application that you distribute for either an iOS device or an Android device. We're using a React Native, which is essentially a Facebook platform, for lack of a better word. So when you're coding for React Native, you're doing it in JavaScript. React Native is essentially Facebook. They really are not Apple people, and they're really not Microsoft people. So some people are saying, well, does this work on Windows? Does Facebook work on Windows? Does Facebook work on Android devices? The answer is yes. This is a uniformly horizontal training exercise. Now, Leland happens to be using a Mac, but this works equally well with the Android devices, which is excellent. Because having access, building Android applications, something that's really not been well supported within the Claris FileMaker platform in our world. So having access to that is really a great thing. So with day 2 going, let's jump right in.
We're live.
This is how you started off yesterday, and I was like, oh my God, right? But then really, this is where you end up someday, but we start off with hello world, which I always love. So
yeah, I think I don't want to intimidate people with that back screen of visual code showing React Native code. It's JavaScript. It's advanced JavaScript. Mostly, I just like to kind of point out that that's what it looks like in everyday usage. What I do day in and day out, it's what you commonly stare at all day long. It's synonymous with you being inside script workspace all day long, right? So a lot of similarities. It just looks different because it's a different language. It has a different set of rules. But other than that, kind of, I don't know, to me, it just kind of introduces the concept of we're starting simple, but what our end goal, our end game is more advanced stuff, right? We're not going to stay in JavaScript 101 for the next 10 years, for Pete's sakes. We're going to learn more. And that's where we are today. So yesterday, we did 7 different versions of Hello World, which really all it was 7 different ways to work with the web viewer inside FileMaker in order to do different things. And the first couple things were just straight HTML and CSS. And then the last 4 things involved a little bit of JavaScript. So it was just a real gentle introduction to how we can use JavaScript within FileMaker and some of the different very simple things we can do, like pass a parameter from FileMaker to JavaScript. Another one was passing a parameter from JavaScript over to FileMaker. And then the last one was a little bit of play, and that was text to speech. Today is going to be a little bit more boring. At least we're going to start out a little bit more boring because what we're doing now is probably synonymous with the classroom of opening up your book, going to a certain page and starting to read out loud and read and try to understand some concepts rather than see a lot of examples. I'm going to try to throw in examples when we can, just to try to alleviate some of the boredom. But other than that, a lot of what we're going to cover, at least initially, is going to be concepts. And hopefully these concepts will answer a lot of your questions that you had yesterday, questions that you'll have today, and questions you'll have tomorrow. So let's begin. We'll actually start with Richard's question from yesterday. And what he noticed was that the script tag was being used in a specific location, which was down in the body. Remember that question, Richard?
Yeah, I was wondering if its positioning made a difference because I've seen it at the bottom before. Most time I see it at the top. I don't know what that signifies.
Right. So in this example, I've placed it in two different places on purpose because one of the things we're going to cover here is that this script tag can be used more than once. And so where you place it becomes a very important question. So in this case, we've got our header, we've got our same block header basic code that we entered in yesterday that may or may not be important, but we're just using it on every example from here on out because it works. You can strip some of it out, test it and see if it works, and then you'll know what the bare minimums are. But this is a good bare minimum to start with. So inside this header right here, I've placed our script tag, and of course it's XML based, so you have a beginning tag and an end tag, and the end tag looks exactly like the beginning tag, but it has that little slash right there. Then we have our body that starts here, and it has two elements in it, an H1 tag and a paragraph of text. And then within inside that body, we included yet another JavaScript set of tags. And we have a simple function called I also do nothing, and it just has a comment. And up here in this JavaScript, we have a function called I do nothing, and it just has a comment. So this is the bare bones functionality of creating a function, number one, of creating something in JavaScript with it just bare bones. It doesn't do anything at all, but it won't give you an error. That's the good news. When you're typing something in FileMaker's calculation engine, when you are typing something in FileMaker's custom function dialog, you have free-form text, right? You're not dragging and dropping anything. You've got some type ahead functionality if you have certain plugins installed and if FileMaker is there, and there's a lot of different ifs and there's and different scenarios that you can run into. But basically, it's free-form typing. You can type anything you want. And guess what happens when you click OK? FileMaker has to look at what you typed, and hopefully it will highlight any errors that it encountered that it just does not understand. You missed a double quote, and so it thinks you're talking about a field when really you were talking about a string of text, right? Everybody's been there. Everybody's done that. You've missed a semicolon inside of a function within the calc engine. And all of those things are all syntax related. They're all checked by the compiler or by FileMaker. Same thing with JavaScript. This is free-form text that I'm entering into the insert text option, which is, as we learned yesterday, very similar to set variable with some benefits. And this field right here is just like the calc engine. It's a free form. I can type anything I want to here, and that's both good and bad. What I want when I'm done is to click the OK button and not have an error. So if we don't have any errors, we're off to a good start. So we have some basic HTML inside of our variable called HTML. Then we're setting our web viewer on our layout with that, and we're exiting the script. And this script is being triggered by this button. So if we run this button, we see the two items that were in our body, our H1 header item and our paragraph item or element, and JavaScript did nothing. It's sitting in there. Matter of fact, if anybody did their homework and has the web inspector available and they go check it out and look at what's actually sitting inside. So inside this web inspector, if I choose sources, we can see here's the contents of my web viewer. This is what's actually sitting in there right now, even though this is all we see. This is the content that's actually in there, and some of it is actually rendered onto the screen. There's the H1 element that's being rendered in large text, bold text right there. And here's the paragraph that's being rendered right below it. And that's in our body, but we also have two hidden JavaScript functions sitting here in our tags, script tags. And these functions have names and their content is just commented out. So they actually do nothing. And we're not even calling the functions, so they're not actually even running, but they're sitting there ready to run if we chose. So going back to the bookwork, The script tag in HTML, JavaScript code is inserted between the script and the closing script tags. And old JavaScript examples you might find out on the web will look like this potentially, where you have script and then a descriptor or attribute called type, text/JavaScript. And everybody will probably recognize that probably as a MIME type. That is no longer required. It used to be, but now JavaScript is the default scripting language in HTML. So the requirement to define what kind of script has gone away. Placing script tags, where can you put them? This addresses Richard's question. You can place any number of scripts in the document. They can be placed in the body or the header or both. And here's the only thing to keep in mind. Performance. Performance becomes an issue when you have large content of HTML and or large amounts of content of JavaScript. If you insert some JavaScript that ends up doing a lot of work, and then below it, you have some UI, like some information to be displayed to the user, the loading of the JavaScript and the performing of the JavaScript can actually slow down the UI of everything being rendered on the screen. So if performance is an issue and if you're dealing with large things, what they recommend, or a best practice, would be to go ahead and place your script tags below or inside the body. And that way, all the UI renders first, then the JavaScript runs. So that's about your only consideration as far as where to place them.
So the script tag beginning and ending tag could be before the body, in the body, or after the body, but before the end of the HTML tag, correct?
And it could be up in the header. Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay.
Now, I'm not sure about outside the body, like below the body, closing and before the end of the HTML. I'm not sure. You might be able to. It's still within HTML, might still work. I haven't tested that. I cannot confirm nor deny.
Okay, cool.
But again, you can place as many as you want. They can be in the header, they can be in the body, they can be in the beginning of the body or the ending of the body, and performance is your only concern. Is that fair? For those of you that have built web pages that have used JavaScript libraries, this next line will look very familiar to you. And what it's doing is it's including a script, a JavaScript file that's external of the current document. So if you're building web pages, you know that there's more than one page. JavaScript can actually sit in a separate file on the server, not actually part of the HTML document at all. And if so, this is what it would look like. Let me get my mouse over it. This is what it would look like here. And it's simply the script tag with a source attribute, and inside double quotes is the full path to the source. So that's about the only different examples you'll see of this script tag being used, but that should cover all of your scenarios. Any questions coming in from outside on script tags before we move to the next portion?
Code to Go says you can write XML in VS Code and copy that to clipboard and then paste. Yeah, there was a little bit of a conversation whenever we run into you mentioned something about like a limitation with the Claris FileMaker platform that's been there for about 1 billion years. Then the longtime experts in the community who are watching this start pontificating about, how come that's not been done and they miss those things, right? Better integration with like an outside code editing application, and then easy transportability inside the script maker for compiling or whatever, right? So
okay.
Anyway, all right.
All right.
Yep, no, we're good.
Next section, functions. We've already seen these a few times, but now let's kind of get into some particulars on functions. So a JavaScript function is a block of code that can be executed when it's called for. Now, that would be like clicking on a button triggers a script, right, in FileMaker? Well, as you saw yesterday in several examples, we click buttons and they can run a script that then runs or triggers a function in our JavaScript that we've placed inside of a web viewer. So most functions run when an event occurs, and there's a few exceptions to that, but that's typically what's going on. And that's how the majority of your FileMaker scripts are run, right? Buttons or events of some sort. It might be an on layout script trigger. That's an event. Could be a mouse click inside of a field. That's an event. So typically most functions and or FileMaker scripts are run and triggered by an event. And it's just kind of, it's theoretical at that point. Not much to argue with there. But mostly your takeaway here for a function is that it's the equivalent of a script or a subscript in FileMaker. So if you've written scripts, you should be comfortable writing JavaScript functions because they're basically doing the same thing. One little note here is arrow functions. And in the React Native world, we use arrow functions a lot, so I'm very used to seeing them. They, however, do not appear to work in FileMaker. And I believe the understanding is that FileMaker and Windows use a specific set of JavaScript instructions, and it's known as ES5, ES6. Arrow functions were introduced in ES6, and I don't think FileMaker supports that in the current web browser. So that's subject to change. So this is being recorded. You watch this in the future, FileMaker might support ES6 and arrow functions might work, but I will at least introduce you to them so that if and when you see them, you don't think that they are something other than what they are. They're actually just functions. So you've seen how the functions have looked so far. Matter of fact, let's jump over to a script and take a look at the one that's applicable for this particular section. And here's our script. We've placed it inside the header this time. We have 3 body elements, H1, a paragraph, and a div with an ID. Our function is called myCustomFunction named anything we wish, and it does 2 things. And we saw yesterday this one, which was the common available function available to JavaScript via HTML and the DOM, which is getElementById. So we are looking for this ID div here that has an ID of myDiv. We're looking for it. We're getting the inner HTML from it. And what are we doing? Actually, we're setting it. We're not getting it. Sorry. So we are setting the inner HTML of that div to be this string, adding this text via JS function. Then we're running a new function that you haven't seen before, but I bet you can probably guess what it does already. It is exactly the same as FileMaker's show custom dialog. It's an alert window that will pop up and it will present this string to the user. So it's a function that does 2 things. It's going to set the div inner HTML right here, and it's going to show an alert to the user. Now, what does the function look like? Well, we have the keyword function. Then we have the name of the function. You notice no spaces. We have parentheses at the end of the function, and that can or can contain an optional parameter. And then we have curly braces. And the curly braces, there's a begin and there's an end. And that is kind of the same if you think of it like a loop within FileMaker. You have a loop and you have an end loop. You have an if and you have an end if. So whenever you have something that can contain multiple things between it, you have a beginning and an end. And a function, beginning is the curly brace, and the ending is the ending curly brace. So you can have as many different commands or blocks or whatever you want to call it in between those curly braces. And so this function, even though it currently only does 2 things, could do a million things. Does that make sense?
So, so are you going to break this down with these individual elements? Because you have a document, then you have a get element. I guess, is that build? Is that what that is?
I assume you're talking about these 2 lines.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you
Okay.
going to dive into those, or are we just going to kind of scoot by
Not
those?
too deep into these because these are just kind of common DOM. This allows us to do something in JavaScript where we can actually see it happen, right? So it's not something you're going to probably use in your FileMaker experience. You might, and it's just kind of an introduction to those, but it's an HTML method that's called document get element by ID. That's the method name, and it accepts a parameter, and the parameter is the name of the ID you want in the DOM, right? Okay. So here's our div, here's our ID, my div. So it's going to find that, and it's going to say, oh, you want this div right here. Okay, here it is. Now what do you want to do with it? What we want to do with it is call a method on that specific element in the DOM, if I can get my mouse to work correctly. And we're going to call a method called inner HTML. And that basically says, give me the contents of the HTML of that item, which right now you notice it's blank. Right here, if we had text in there, we would see it on the screen, but right now it's blank. So when we get the contents, if we were to get the contents, we would get back an empty string and we would dump it into a variable, right? So we would have VAR in front of this. We would be asking for something, but in this case, we're setting it. So we're setting the inner HTML to this string. So let me run that just so that you can see what it is we're talking about. This puts the basic information on the screen without any JavaScript. This button's going to run that JavaScript, which there's our alert, JS function ran. Okay. And here's the div contents, inner HTML being edited and tossed in with that string that we passed it.
Yeah. So I just had never seen inner HTML, or at least not seen it to the point where I wanted to know what it did. So yeah.
Right. So what that allowed us to do is programmatically, we added some content to our HTML web page, right? So this init is kind of the same of going out in your internet browser and grabbing a page off the internet and presenting it, and it's rendered here on screen and it's done, right? Nothing's running, nothing's paused. It's fully rendered, there it is. But there's some JavaScript sitting there. There's a div sitting here that's empty and it has an ID. And when we hit run, what we're doing is we're telling the JavaScript that's in this web browser, hey, that div that's blank, fill it with this stuff that we pass in, right? So without re-rendering our screen or hitting refresh, we get two things that happen, including populate data on the screen. That's kind of an Ajax command, right? We didn't refresh anything from the server. We added content to a web page that was already done and rendered.
Can you go back to that script, the step 4 script?
Step 4. Now step 4, did you mean the one that just ran or something else?
Yeah, it was, well, you had step 1, well, you had the 2 on the demo. You had the first step, and then you had the second step, which created the red text, right? You push this, then you push this. So that runs one script and this runs the next script, correct?
Okay, that's where you're getting a little confused. So let me stop and clarify that, because if you're confused, our audience will be too, right?
Yeah, yeah.
This init runs this script only, which just takes our HTML that we've handwritten and it populates it into the viewer and it's done. That's all it does.
And so that's that .1 there. Okay, got that. All right, great.
Then the second part is that second button that says run, and run performs a function that's in our JavaScript that's sitting in that web viewer. This actually triggers that JavaScript function to run. Yeah, sorry, I kind of blew past that yesterday in example and didn't elaborate today.
Well, no, it's so this. Okay, so this sets it in here, and then this is telling a function that's already sitting in here to execute, right?
Absolutely correct.
Okay, great. Yep. So there's really the third piece, which is the part where we had the code. So it's really three, almost like three pieces a little bit. I mean, well, kind of yes and no, because you actually had the code where we're looking at the code, right? This sets that code into there, right? So
this right here reveals what's currently sitting in our web viewer after I hit the init button, and I have not hit run yet. This is what's in our web viewer. That function is sitting there quietly, not being run yet. When we hit that run button, I tell FileMaker to perform a JavaScript function in this web viewer, and I give it the name of that function right there.
Got it.
And then these two pieces of code runs. Does that help clarify?
So as a reminder, this was your homework assignment yesterday. This is the source of this like this web browser right here, right? And this is normally you can't see it unless you follow one of the instructions that Margaret just posted on how to have it display either on the Mac or on Windows, right?
Yeah, it's built into your machine. It's just off by default, just exactly like FileMaker Pro advanced menus are off by default and you have to turn them on.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yep, the instructions we put in the chat yesterday helps explain how to turn it on so that you can access it. Once you have it turned on, what I'm doing here is I move my mouse anywhere inside of the web viewer and I right click, and that makes the inspect element available. Now that only works if there's content in the web viewer. If it's blank, you won't be able to see that. So if I go into layout mode, go into browse mode, because this was a blank web viewer, now when I right click, I don't get anything. As soon as I click init, now we've populated the web viewer. Now it has content, and I can see that content. If I go to the web inspector, and there's several tabs to pick from, I have to pick sources to see the content of that web viewer currently.
Yeah, if you have a somewhat of a programming background, then all you, like for me, it goes way back to Fortran and like that. And so the idea is to adapt what I already know to how this is working, right, in a practical sort of way. And it's interesting. I love learning. That's why I'm doing aviation stuff like that. I love learning. To me, this is exciting. I love this stuff. Some comments or questions, Margaret? Are you playing air traffic control with us a little bit here?
Yes, I've got one from Stu. So getting the inner HTML is the same setting, except getting has to set to a variable? ?
Let's find an example from yesterday that did that same thing here. Let's see if this has it. No, it does not. Just kind of browse through these till I find it. Bear with me a moment. There's one right here. This is the exact same method, document.getElementById, with passing in the parameter of the name of the ID, but this time this is a getter, because we're saying we have a variable we're going to call our h1, and we set it equal to the contents of what this returns. And what this returns is whatever our h1 is, right? So that's
Okay.
how we get information from it, and we store it into our own local variable. Now, what we see today, this one, we're using the exact same method, passing in the parameter, but this time we're getting that back, but we're not assigning it to a variable. We're getting it back, and then with the .inner HTML, we're saying, hey, get the inner HTML, well, set the inner HTML with this equal sign. We're saying set it to be this value. So yeah, the way that you view or look at whether you're setting something or getting something looks slightly different, but hopefully I've explained it in a way where it kind of makes sense. In this case, we're taking this and we're setting it. The equal sign means set it to this value, right? Where the other one,
what does a dot generally mean? Is that like an option, like you have a period or a dot right there, and then
the dot is exactly like what you're already used to in FileMaker with JSON. If you look at your data API results, if you run an execute data API result in FileMaker, you'll get back JSON response, right? And if you look through that, you'll have the data element in your response. The first, it's an array, so your first 0 indexed array is your first record in that return result. Then you have dot field set, right? Then you have dot and the name of your field. So what you do is you're drilling down into that object to get to what it is that you want the end result to be. So this is the same thing. We're getting back an element, and inside that element, it's going to come back with an object with a bunch of things inside of it. And one of the things is an HTML. So .inner HTML triggers that particular element, piece of that element, just like your field set. Field set, that doesn't sound right. I haven't seen data API results for a little while, and I just kind of blow through them. I think it's field set. Sounds right.
All right, cool. David Angels, if you want to look at the last question on Discord right there from David Angel, variables inside script are only valid between script and close script.
So he's talking about variable scope. That's a very complicated topic. I like to kind of cover scope as I see it, but basically what he's saying is that if you've got that whole multiple JavaScript between scripts in multiple places, like well, let me just show you. In scripts, the last script that we looked at with tags, I had them in two different places, right? I had this script up here with a function in it, and I had this script down here with a function in it. And what he's saying is that variables you have in one, you can't see in the other one. They're out of scope. So it's the same thing as not being able to see a variable defined here over in this script over here. Different scope, different script. A single variable is only alive while this script is running, right? It doesn't exist when the script's not running. And a global variable exists by session, by user, through all the scripts, right? So that's scope. That's a entirely different topic, rather complex. But yeah, he pointed out something that we can just kind of cover right now, which is in these two scripts, variables in one cannot be seen in the other.
Cool.
And so we covered tags, we covered functions. Now we'll cover an interesting type of function, which we've actually used once in our Hello World yesterday, and that's an anonymous function. An anonymous function is a function without a name. That's how you recognize it. And it's not accessible after its initial creation because once it's created, it runs and then it disappears. It's just not accessible anymore. It doesn't have a name. So it's just basically, it's considered to be in FileMaker world to be the opener script. Right? That's typically you only ever run that once, and it's when the file first opens, and after that you can, but usually you don't run it again until they close the file and reopen it. So it's kind of the same thing, right? So it looks a heck of a lot different. It's got a whole bunch of parentheses going on, but that's really what it looks like. You'll notice the end curly bracket here and the beginning curly bracket, parentheses and function, those are all the same. So really all we've added is another parenthesis in front of it all, another parenthesis in the end of it all, and then another pair of parentheses and a semicolon. So it looks funky, but, and what this little note is down here is if you forget some of that syntax, you'll get an error. Well, go figure. You miss one semicolon in a million lines of code and the whole thing crumps, right? Typical. This note down here is stating that, let me start down here actually first. Functions are wild in JavaScript because, like somebody quoted it somewhere, they're considered first-class citizens, which is an interesting theoretical way of saying Therefore, you can actually pass a function to another function as a parameter or as an argument. So imagine a world where in a FileMaker script, instead of typing in perform script, right, to run another script within a script within another script with subscripts, right, instead of doing that, imagine that you could pass that script in like to a set variable by name as a parameter, and FileMaker would just treat it and run it as a script. That's what's going on with, that's the power of functions in JavaScript, is that they're first class citizens and they can actually be passed as arguments. So that really gives you a lot of power, and with a lot of power comes a lot of responsibility, right? The famous movie quote. So
Yeah.
Here's an example of that happening, just so you can kind of expand your mind and blow your mind all at the same time. We have a function called set timeout, and we pass in the parameter function. It's an anonymous function without a name. There's the curly brace where it begins and where it ends.
It runs immediately, right? It runs immediately without a name. It's going to run.
This function being anonymous runs immediately. Yes, correct.
Yep.
Well, the trick is that immediate function only runs when it's triggered. And the trigger is going to be based upon when this function tells it to trigger.
Okay.
And so in this case, that function runs after 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second.
Okay.
So this is a way to delay a function from running exactly 1 second later. And what you're doing is you're passing a function in as a parameter. And so this function is not available outside of this code right here. So its scope is within this function. That's the only place it exists. So in this case, what does this function do? It logs something to the console. So it's real simple, nothing complicated, but it's kind of cool because there's a delay of 1 second. But that's an example of passing a function as an argument to another function. Kind of wild. And wow, I mean, there is some power there. With regard to functions that we saw on the last step, arrow functions is an ES6 feature that's not currently supported in FileMaker, but will probably be in the future. And it's certainly very relevant in React Native and in the web out there. Go ahead, Richard.
I have a question. You keep saying ES, and I'm assuming that's some sort of standard like ES4 and then ES5.
It is. And
ES stands for extra sensory perception, or?
Good question. I knew it at one point, and now I don't remember. See if Google can help me really quick.
It's just like it's like the official standard of JavaScript. Like JavaScript could be ES.
It's a standard. It stands for ECMA script. Yeah, I mean it's a standard. So this will probably blow it out. Yes. Okay. So there's a standardization, and they have versions. So it's a version of JavaScript, and yeah, you can look it up. ECMA
and for
script.
Reference right now, the current reference version is 6 right now. Is that what you said? The current version?
Yes. Yes. And so I use 6 a lot in other places, but it does not currently work in FileMaker. So I think it's probably tied to the web browser and not FileMaker would be my guess. So I'm sure it would be lovely for you and I to be sitting at Pause on Error right now, sitting around with some of the Claris engineers, poking them, going, "Hey, why not ES6 in the browser? Tell us why." And they would probably have a ready answer for us, right? All right, I do have a script available for this anonymous function. I'm going to click on it, and it immediately does something down here in our browser window. This text is only displayed via anonymous function, and you notice it was immediate. So if we go and take a look at that script, it's again just creating some HTML, dumping it into our web viewer. That's all the script does. But if we take a look at that HTML, we have our basic header going on up here. We have a body with one item in it, a div with an ID of my div. We have a function that's anonymous, no name, and it does one thing, and it gets the element by ID. It grabs the inner HTML of that, and actually it doesn't grab it. It sets it to this. Now, this is kind of interesting because you notice I didn't set it to just a string. I set it to actual HTML code, which includes a string. So this is kind of interesting, right? I included style of color blue along with an H1 header element for that text. So the end result when we saw it on screen was we got the H1 in blue. So that would be kind of cool if in FileMaker, if every single time we passed a string anywhere, we could actually pass in HTML along with it, right? Why not? That would be interesting. Now, I think you can do that with a specific function that I don't use, right? Can't you do stuff with CSS in FileMaker? I've seen it.
Oh yeah.
I've hardly used it, maybe once, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, well,
but
that works fine. I was just thinking about the fact that you actually are substituting executable code into that.
Did we get the question from Andy?
Still not understandable how you can have a standard engine. You can't even provide support if one user can't see stuff.
Well, you kind of have to develop for your least common denominator, right? I mean, ES5 has been out for a very long time. I'm sure, I don't know if it's been out the entire time that FileMaker's had a web viewer, but the fact that ES6 adds functionality that wouldn't currently work today in FileMaker, I mean, you have compatibility issues with everything you do. How many script steps do you not have available to you in FileMaker Go or WebDirect? I mean, they can't give you everything, but you need to be aware as a developer what's available in what platform and what isn't. So you just have to write JavaScript code specifically for FileMaker in ES5. It's very simple. You might want to do it ES6, but you might want to do something special in FileMaker Go and you can't do it either because there's some limitations, right? So can't make everybody happy, right? Okay, the next one is kind of a fun one. It's output. I remember using a computer from a very, very young person, and the most interesting thing we could possibly do would be to show something with output. So I remember sitting down in my second or third day of computer class with a bunch of Apple IIes around the room, and I remember typing in 10 space, let x equal 1, hit return, 20, let x equal x plus 1, print x, and a go-to loop, and you'd hit return and the screen would just start counting. And with like 4 lines of code that you could type in 60 seconds, your screen was doing stuff and your neighbor was looking at you like you're a genius, right? That was fun days. So your output is always the end game, the end result for your user. Everything you do in FileMaker is all for output. That's it. That's all you ever do, right? So what kind of outputs are available with JavaScript is what we're going to cover now. The first one you've already seen, which is we can write to an HTML element using inner HTML. You've seen that a few times, right? Where we get the div by ID and we change its inner HTML to whatever we want. So that's the first thing you can do to change some output. The second one is rather obscure. I've never used it, but it was in the doc, so I decided to include it so I didn't have a whole bunch of people pinging, hey, you forgot one. Well, here it is. You can use document.write. But as you see down here, don't do it. It should only be used for testing. I've never used it, but it's there. So I don't know who, what, when, where, and why you'd want to use it, but there it is. The third one you've also seen today, an alert box. You can plop an alert up in front of the user and you can put in anything you wish. So that's one way of output. The next one is fun. It can only be done in the web. Well, in FileMaker, you can only see the results in the web inspector. You can use it all day long. You just can't see the results unless you have the web inspector. And we'll take a look at that in a minute. And the last thing you can do is the most fun for FileMaker developers. And that is the ability of sending data to FileMaker from JavaScript as a parameter using FileMaker.performScript. You notice the dot there, Richard? There is a FileMaker object inside your web viewer, and it has 2 things that you have access to. One of which is PerformScript. The other one is PerformScript with option. So you only have 2 things you can do with FileMaker today with the way that FileMaker builds it to you by default. And you have access to that by using that dot syntax right there. So that's probably a better example to kind of wrap your head around what that dot means with that whole inner HTML thing, right?
Yeah, there's real quick here. There's a bit of a conversation going on over here on Discord, and they're talking about a screenshot that Peter Geens put up, but that's 5 years ago. So Jacob Taylor, are you here? I don't know if I can get Jacob or at least to chime in here a little bit, but the idea was that within the last couple versions of like 19.2 or 19.3, Claris went to support Edge on Windows with its web viewer.
Right.
And so there was a conversation going here that ES6 wasn't really supported with Internet 11, IE11. I mean, if anyone's using stuff with IE11, yeah, that's really old, right? It was old when Claris finally quit using it. I'm hoping Edge, the new Edge that they're supporting, fully supports ES6, right? So Jacob says we did not move to Edge Web View in FileMaker until 19.3. Yeah. So keep in mind for those of you, and I'm just going to state this it's slightly off topic, but people go, hey, I'm still using FileMaker 18 because it's only the last version. Okay, let me just as a reminder for everyone here in case you missed this, FileMaker shipped the very first version 19 like 3 years ago. They don't even support the first release 19.0 anymore. Claris went to this like 19.1 and 19.2 and 19.3 and 19.4 and 19.5 and 19.6. And so at some point, they're going to probably jump to the next whole number, I would guess. I don't know entirely when that will be, but eventually they'll get tired of calling it 19.7 and 19.8. But if you're on 18, you're on unsupported software that's really ancient. And if you're on FileMaker 16, I don't know, I have a computer that runs 16. I have to go back to my office and find one that's buried under a desk. But I would encourage you to get up to date with that because there's a lot of improvements with the product. So anyway, keep going. Sorry.
Quite all right. Good stuff. Okay. All right. So let's let's run the script that I have available to us here and see what happens here. We hit init and we get some content down here in our web viewer. And let's just jump over to the web inspector right away. There's our content sitting inside our web viewer. But this time, you'll notice that I actually used the console log option. So here's where you can see it in the console. And well, I haven't actually ran it yet, so I guess we better run it if we're going to see something. Let's run our JavaScript, and we get a pop-up alert. We get a FileMaker alert. We get some content down here that was changed. And if we look in our console log, we have a message. This message was generated in our JS function. So that's the console log in effect. It dumps into this log that you can only see if you have developer tools or in Safari and or Web Inspector turned on in FileMaker. And now let's go look at the rest of that script actually in FileMaker instead of this web viewer. See what we did. And my keyboard shortcut does not work when Web Inspector is up front. Okay, output. Here's our script right here. And we have a few more lines going on here. We have a function that does 5 different things. All right. So our function name in this case is try all of the outputs. The very first thing it does is it uses something you haven't seen before, which is const. Stands for constant. It's kind of like defining a variable, but it's a variable that can't change. It's a constant. So have you ever done anything like that in FileMaker, Richard?
Well,
have something that's kind of a constant?
Yeah, but then we set it as like a global or something in the startup script, and then we never touch it. It's off
There
limits,
you go.
right?
Okay. And what I've done in the past also, I've created a calculated field that just has a static value in it. Right? Never changes.
Yeah, we use that actually all the time, right? So yeah, that technique. Yeah.
Okay. So that's synonymous with what we're doing here. We're creating a variable called our message. We're making it a constant, which means we're not going to change it anywhere else within scope of this variable. And what we did is we set it to a text string, and it just simply says this message was generated in our JS function. Okay, simple. We created a variable. Our second line is what we've seen before. We grab an element that's in our DOM called myDiv, and we set the inner HTML to be not a static string, but we set it to be the contents of our variable. That should make sense to you because that would be like setting a variable in FileMaker to be the value of another variable, right? So as long as it's in scope, you're good. You can define X to be 1, then you can set variable Y equals $X, right? You can set a variable to equal a value of another variable. That's what we're doing here. Then here's our first bit of output. Well, second bit of output. The first bit of output is that it changes the HTML of that div, so that should show up on the screen, right? Then our alert shows up, our message. Again, we're passing in not a static item, but our variable that we already declared. So the alert pops up. Then we dump that same message to the console log, which you saw in the web inspector. And last but not least, we trigger a FileMaker script called FMP console, and we pass it a parameter, which is, again, the same message. So now let's go take a look at this script over in FileMaker. That's down here in Utilities. And what that does is it takes in a parameter, whatever JavaScript sends us, and we show a custom dialog with that data in it. You saw that pop up, right? I kind of blew past it kind of quick. But then I'm also setting a global variable. And look what I'm setting it to. I'm setting it to a list, which hopefully most of you are familiar with. It takes the contents of whatever's already in that global and adds more to it. And what I'm adding is get current timestamp, a dash, and then whatever I passed in. So if we go to our data viewer, what do we have? There's our global, and here's the contents of that global. And you see I actually hit it twice, one at 3:30 and one at 4:50. And this gives me a running list with timestamps, so it kind of acts like the console. I can see a running list of when this was triggered, and it just keeps it for the whole session. Kind of a cool little tip and trick, right?
Yep.
And then it exits. So that is our output. How many different ways?
It was like
scroll. That was 5 different ways. No, we did not use document write. So that was 4 different ways. The DOM, the DOM manipulated.
You did document, you just didn't write it, right? So
no, we haven't used document at all. That's kind of a global, and it's kind of a given, so I don't use that term. We did we did a method on the document, which was the get element by ID. Good catch.
Okay, I saw the word document.
Yeah,
right?
You saw it somewhere.
Right? I saw it somewhere.
You did.
Sorry, this is very basic for me. So a lot of you are very advanced, but yeah, so.
Okay, so the rest of this screen kind of defines what we did for each step. This is a breakdown of the inner HTML with an example of it being used.
Oh, this is a really nice file.
And there's a note here. Yeah. Again, most of this kind of came from W3 Schools, by the way. So if you jump over there and look at output, you'll see a lot of this. Not all of it, because I only grabbed certain portions and pieces, but they have a note over that says changing the inner HTML property of an HTML element is a common way to display data in HTML. Yeah, it is. Okay. So don't use document write. Window alert. Here's some examples on that. You can skip the here's an interesting note. It's actually window.alert is the full actual code name for calling an alert up on the screen in JavaScript, but there's a note here that you can skip the window keyword because over time, the window keyword has become optional, kind of like it's optional to describe what kind of script that you're inserting into your HTML is now no longer required. Yeah, so. Console log is very useful for debugging purposes, but again, you can only see it if you have a web inspector turned on. And lastly, FileMaker perform script. You can pass data back to FileMaker Pro from your JavaScript code and present it using FileMaker Pro tools. And all we did is we showed it. Matter of fact, I'll just run it again now that we've gone through it all. We hit init. Down at the bottom, we have 2 lines in our output. And when we hit run, we get our alert. We get our FileMaker data presentation that came to us in a FileMaker script parameter, which we then used show custom dialog to display. And then we have our div that was altered. And then in the console log, we have our generated message here in the console. And if we go back to FileMaker, and if I can get zoom tools out of the way so I can access my data viewer, we will see that we now have a new entry in our running console log. So I think we covered quite a bit. Has there been any margins? Has there been any questions pouring in we haven't addressed yet? If I remember, I usually at the end of each program, I usually go through Discord, scroll through, and look at what's been posted. So I will come on and be sure to read that, and I might address that
as far
after
as
hours.
Want to go? Because we can extend a little bit.
If we can extend a little bit, I'm good. If you're good,
let's go ahead and do that. Keep going.
Okay. The next one is statements and keywords. This one's rather theoretical and kind of long in the tooth, but we'll try to abbreviate it a little bit. But there's some important bits that we want to get to kind of quickly. So to get through kind of the boring stuff, to define program statements and code, a JavaScript program is a list of programming statements. Statements are composed of values, operators, expressions, keywords, and comments. Most JavaScript programs contain many JavaScript statements. Statements are executed one by one in the same order they're written, and JavaScript programs are often called JavaScript code. So let's kind of blow through that. It's kind of some defining terminology so that when we use that terminology later, you can always go back and see if it meant what you thought it meant, but it's not something you need to memorize or really take away. Here's where we start to get some important stuff like semicolons. You've probably seen them sporadically in my code sometimes and sometimes not. So what are the semicolons all about? Well, in FileMaker, you use them quite a bit inside functions inside of a calc engine, right? That is the delimiter or separator between various parameters. If you've got a method like an if statement, it's got 3 parameters, right? Your condition, your true result, and your false result. So they're separated by semicolons. So you're used to seeing them in FileMaker, and they behave very similarly in JavaScript. Here's the takeaway. Ending statements with a semicolon is not required, but highly recommended. So consider it to be a best practice. White space, and I was giving synonymous to semicolons like what we do in freeform text within functions within Calc Engine, right? Like an if statement, parameters are separated by semicolons. They're required. You have to put them in there. You can't miss out on them. In JavaScript, they're similar, but most semicolons are not required, but they are highly recommended. So it's kind of a best practice. Best practice. Thank you. White space is just exactly like FileMaker. JavaScript ignores multiple spaces. You can add it to make it more readable. It's not required. Here's an example of using it versus not using it, and they're equivalent. A good best practice is to be sure to put spaces around operators. So if you're using plus, minus, divide, equal, do the due diligence and put spaces around it. It makes it more readable, and it's a best practice. So we'll just leave it at that. Code blocks. Code blocks are statements, and that's kind of why we went over the whole boring statement declaration up above definition, are grouped together in code blocks. So if you look at a function, think of it like a script. This function has 2 things that it does. That would be synonymous with a FileMaker script having 2 lines of code that it runs. Two script steps would be the way to phrase that, right? And the entire function in JavaScript is called, or everything in between curly braces is called a code block. Okay, so that's mostly just kind of some definitions so that when we're talking about things, we kind of understand what we're talking about. One place you will find statements grouped together in blocks is JavaScript functions. So that's just kind of being extra emphasis on defining exactly what code blocks are, programs, statements, and code blocks. Now we move to keywords. Keywords pretty much have the same rules as FileMaker does. There's things that there's reserved words you can't use. Here's a list of them. You can't name your variable if, right? It just ain't going to work. Probably ain't going to work so well over in FileMaker either. There's a lot of things you can call your fields, and there's things you can't call. And then there's best practices of things you probably should not call your field. Leland's field number 12 is probably not a very good idea. You can do it. So just like FileMaker, JavaScript has keywords that are reserved. They cannot be used for names for variables. And I think we can leave that at that with keywords. So that was kind of some boring stuff to blow through. If there's probably not any questions, we'll move on to syntax, which is closely related to what we just covered.
Okay.
Oh, you're good.
And that, go ahead, what?
You're good.
Okay. Literals. Rules for literals. Strings are text, and you can use double or single quotes. So that's an important thing to take away. In FileMaker, they're different, right? You can actually have single quotes inside double quotes. Well, you can in JavaScript too, but you can mix and match them, and sometimes how you use them will help you do things like not having to escape the other one, so on and so forth. You probably just want to be consistent on which one you use, and just mostly what I've done, if everybody else learns the same way that I do, I look at a lot of other people's code that's posted, code that I consider to be from a good source, and especially from frameworks like React Native or something. There's a lot of sample code that I learned from in order to learn even how to do some simple things. So I learn a lot by seeing how everybody else does it, right? And in FileMaker, I will put a huge thank you, kudos out to Matt Petrowski. Some of his stuff I've taken and it's become my gospel that I work with, right? I do things based upon a lot of his recommendations as far as FileMakerStandards.org, naming conventions I use for fields, tables, you name it. So whatever you use, just be consistent. Numbers can be written with or without decimals. So here's an example of a decimal with and without, very similar to FileMaker. Variable names, probably very similar to FileMaker as well, as far as what you can use, what you can't. Some things to note, there's 3 ways to declare variables: var, let, and const. You've seen 2 of them so far, the variable and the const. Let is another one that's out there. Which one you use can be something that we can talk about later and not get too far down in the rabbit hole. But here's an example of something that you really can't, well, you kind of can do this in FileMaker. Let's see if we could do this synonymously in FileMaker. Let x semicolon, and then x equals 6 semicolon. That would be the equivalent of, in FileMaker, a set variable step with a name of $x, but the value blank. Then the next script step, set variable $x equal to 6. You see the difference? You're defining the fact that you're going to be using a variable called x, but this first line here is not giving it a value. You're just saying, hey, set me aside some room in memory for x. I'll tell you later what it's going to be. And then you give it a value later. It doesn't have to be the next line. It could be 12 lines down. So I guess that's kind of synonymous with FileMaker, but that's something that I don't use too very often, but occasionally I do. So it's good to note that that is legal. It's totally something that is feasible. We'll kind of skip the history lesson there. Let's go to operators. Pretty much identical to FileMaker. I don't know if there's any difference at all. The only interesting thing to note, as with most programming languages, the asterisk or shift 8 is the equivalent of multiplication, and your slash next to your shift key, that's considered a / is your division. And parentheses are used to separate things algebraically. Comments.
Questions.
Go ahead.
Okay. What do you do when you are working with JavaScript and it doesn't work in Safari? For example, the voice recorder capability.
That's an unfortunate thing that I suppose deals with compatibility. I mean, we deal with that as FileMaker developers all the time, right? You build a solution like Pac-Man, and then it works great on my Mac in my version of FileMaker. And then I try it on other machines and other people watching over other people's shoulders, and they try it on a Windows machine, and somebody tries to use it on Go, and somebody tries to use it in version 18 versus 19.1. This one's on 19.3. Compatibility issues is the world we live in. And unfortunately, what you just described sounds to me like a compatibility issue. What works and what doesn't. You just have to develop it and test it and find out. And it's constantly changing, right? Because it's out of our hands. We didn't create it. FileMaker didn't create it. So it's evolving.
Yeah, FileMaker just has to try to stay up to date with supporting it. I think that's an essential item. Also, I would say that if you're building something and you're living, I would argue, and you can disagree with me, Leland, but I would argue that putting 4,000 containers on a layout and driving Pac-Man through that is a edge case. And Claris bears no responsibility if your doesn't work in Windows, right? So
absolutely,
what you've done to make that work is extraordinary, but it's also, I would say, very edge case. So if you had like a more of a mainstream, like we have an app, it's going to talk to PayPal, get some information, it's going to talk to Twilio, basic stuff like that. That really should work horizontally across all the platforms. And if it doesn't, then that's why I tell people test early, test often. When you're building an application, I tell all my developers, some of them are listening here, some of them should be listening here, that on their desk should be at least a Mac and a Windows machine, and they're building on one or testing on the other, and vice versa. And also with Go on a mobile device and WebDirect if necessary. That way they can experience the problem early in the development cycle, not late when the customer's going, oh, by the way, did you guys test this on Android with GWiz browser? And my staff goes, oh, oh, God, I forgot about that. I hope it's not broken. And the customer goes, hey, it's broke. And you're like, oh, shit. So you can't be lazy about, as a developer, testing this stuff. You've got to be, if you don't want to be embarrassed and roasted over a fire by your customer, whoever that is, whether you're internal or external developer, you need to test early and often on all the deployments that you expect to support. So
and what you just said applies totally over in the web development world too, right? If you're a front-end web developer, you are not developing on one browser. You're trying it on 5, 6, 7 browsers, different versions, finding out what works and what doesn't, deciding whether or not you're going to allow an exception just to fix one problem over here. Yeah. It's a developer's world's nightmare, but it's business as usual.
Okay.
Business, that's good. All right, what else?
So, in JavaScript, you always need to init variables before using it? Question mark.
I believe without exception that is true. Yes. Yes, it has to be declared. Now, it does not have to be declared the same way that this example shows. It can be declared just like this, which is your first use of that variable, right? So this is both a declaration and a value setter all in one line. Declare it, give it a value. But yes, that's required. You could not have a function that just says x equals 5 by itself. You would get a syntax error. X is not defined.
Next question, FileMaker.performance script parentheses is the only FileMaker injected function in WebViewer? Question mark.
There's actually two. The other one is with option. That's as of 19.16 or something. Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about that yesterday. The one was kind of the first cut of it, and then after the developers complained, Claris created the second variation of it with options, which is actually the one I would try to use for the most part. There is this figure desfondo. I don't know how this. We have conversations, and I guess people miss the conversation. They don't understand what we're saying, so I'm going to repeat this real quick. So,
matter of fact, here in the web viewer, Richard, just to slightly interrupt you, if I go into the web viewer and I take a look at the FileMaker object that's in the web viewer, there's your two functions that are available right there. So,
perform script with options is an advanced version of perform script. Perform script with options tells you the timing of the script execution relative to the JavaScript. It's kind of cool. It can happen before, after, etc., during. There's all sorts of interesting stuff with that. So back to figure desfondo, he asked the question mark, exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point, can FileMaker run on Android? Okay. The answer, there is no native client on Android. If you want to run on Android right now, there's three ways of doing. If you're trying to get a FileMaker app to somehow be reflected on Android, one, you can use WebDirect, which is kind of hit and miss. Two, and you can't, and then WebDirect is a website, so it's not really something you can install on the Android device. You can run live code by their application and go through the process of building a application that runs on Android from that. That's live code. The third way is what we're doing at week 3, why you might want to pay for week 3 with Leland here. He's going to be showing you how to do React Native, essentially to create a compilable application that runs on your Android and or iOS device, either one, right?
And what I show you in that class is how to connect it to FileMaker server so that you have a front end for FileMaker data.
Correct.
Natively in Android.
So I think it's a high value week, and so the answer is there is no FileMaker Go application for Android, and there's never going to be one ever, despite what the management team at Claris said at DevCon once upon a time. They said, oh yeah, no problem. That guy got fired, okay? Where are we at? Are we good enough, far enough along? It is 17, it's 5:14 your time, local time.
I think we can cut it here as well as anywhere else. We still have 2 days to go, so.
Well, you actually have Friday. Yeah, you have 2 days. You're going to need all of Friday, right? I told you need all of Friday. Oh, Richard, I don't think you're going to need Friday. Never argue with the boss.
Don't argue with the Richard.
Any other questions, Margaret, as we land the airplane?
No, I think you are free to fly away.
This is your captain speaking. Stand by to land the aircraft. If you could quit sharing your screen for the moment. All right, everyone. So tomorrow is going to be picking up the conversation. JavaScript 101 this week. The next week is going to be JavaScript 102 and 103. And then after that is going to be week 3 is the page shenanigans. If you want more information on what you're doing, you steer your web browser towards fmtraining.tv. You can click over here at the right side. You come down, you got the live training schedule up here, various things you can purchase. JavaScript training right here. We are going to enable a button for you folks to get to the recordings. That'll come on the next, say, 24 hours or so. As we start to load the recordings in there, you'll see that. So that's where they'll happen in there. You'll have to put your name and email in there. We want to know who's watching the free training. We're not trying to charge you any money. We just want to know who you are. Most of you get our newsletters anyway, so you would be volunteering for our newsletter, and it helps Leland know who loves him, right? Now, if you really, really, really love Leland a lot and you want to thank him for his hard work, then you come down here and you go through and you buy the $299 week 3 training, which is on the React Native for iOS and Android. So there you go. All right, so that's it. We appreciate everyone. You have a good day. We'll catch you tomorrow. Same time, same station. Thanks, Leland. Good job.
Thank you.
Got a report of an individual up here who may be a FileMaker license. Well, it's potentially expired. Look at the back of that car right there. Looks like the FileMaker license has expired. Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle. Sir, step out of the vehicle. Sir.